few teams were talked about as often as the Atlanta Falcons this offseason, particularly around draft time, because of what they did, drafting Michael Penix at number 8 overall. But Falcons bring in Raheem Morris as the new head coach. Our old friend Zach Robinson to call plays on the offensive side of the ball. We'll be referencing Zach quite a bit here on the show. Unless things go south, then we'll just, dismiss ourselves from knowing him. But a fascinating team. Kirk Cousins is in. Michael Penix picked at number 8 overall. What are your thoughts on the Falcons as we head into 2024, Sam?
Yeah, not just referencing our friend Zach Robinson. Hopefully at some stage we'll get our friend Zach Robinson on the show and actually, talk to him a bit. But yeah, Atlanta had a fascinating offseason. Obviously, they needed a quarterback. They had one of the worst quarterback situations in the NFL last season, arguably the worst. And yet they were still not a bad football team overall. But with a new coaching regime, they set about to fix that. And they did it first and foremost with free agency and Kirk Cousins, who was realistically the one kind of proven quality veteran option out there in free agency. And I know, Pittsburgh got Russell Wilson. They also brought in Justin Fields. There were other sort of options, but nobody as clean as Kirk Cousins in terms of the level he's been at over the last few years. Now, you do have 35 years old coming off an Achilles injury, so it's not like it was perfect, but theoretically, I think the Falcons, by upgrading from the kind of Desmond Ridder situation at quarterback to Kirk Cousins, immediately transformed themselves into a playoff team overnight. I mean, they literally became the favorites for the division if you check the Vegas odds, basically the second they made that move. And then obviously you get the draft, and everyone assumes they're going to then spend their top draft pick on a defender, try and bolster that side of the ball, and instead they double down on the future, essentially, and draft Michael Penix Jr., a quarterback that theoretically should not be seeing the field for at least a couple of years, which really is unprecedented in terms of the combination of factors, right? How high that draft pick was, the fact that they just signed Kirk Cousins, how old Michael Penix is, all these things put together, it's never really happened before that way. But you can kind of at least see the argument that they're going for, right? The succession plan, the Jordan Love idea, this concept of not just securing the most important position for this year, but for the next 12 years. I don't know if I would have done it myself, but I at least get what they did and why they did it.
We could spend hours talking about the Michael Penix Jr. decision, and we have, Sam, in the past, so we can't get too far into it. But the bottom line is no team has made that type of quarterback investment at that level of extreme, probably in NFL history, as far as the money toward Kirk Cousins, and then in that same year, the number 8 overall pick. And the reason why I think it surprised people, or one of the reasons, is because at number 8 overall, the Falcons had their choice of the best defensive player in the draft, presumably one of those edge rushers. They need edge rush help, and we'll get into what that looks like on the defensive side of the ball. But that's the Michael Penix Jr. storyline. I hope that doesn't overshadow the fact that, as you mentioned, the Falcons should be the favorite in the NFC South. They're a team that went 7-10 last year with really horrible quarterback play, not just on a play-by-play basis, but in crunch time, right? In these close games when they had chances to either, hold on to a lead or go and win a game, and they're, throwing red zone interceptions. It was bad. And so this team had a feisty defense last year. That's how I always describe them. And then offensively, just, overflowing with playmakers, right? You've got Drake London on the outside. You have Kyle Pitts at tight end. You have Bijan Robinson at running back. You have Darnell Mooney coming in. And so this should be an explosive offense with Kirk Cousins at the helm. And, those playmakers really underwhelmed from a production standpoint because of the quarterback play over the last couple of years. And it'll be on Zach now to implement what looks like a very Rams-like offense, a lot of 3 wide receiver sets, trying to get their guys in space, playing to their strengths, but it's going to be a lot more pass-heavy than it was under Arthur Smith.
Yeah, and critically, Zach bringing that offense across, it's also basically the same offense that Kirk Cousins has been running and playing his best football in for the last couple of years in Minnesota. So it should theoretically create this kind of seamless transition for Cousins. And then, the key is looking at all those weapons that they have. And if we just look at the offensive side of the ball, I mean, I think the Falcons should be really good. They have one of the better offensive lines in the NFL. Maybe it'll look a little bit worse this season now that they're not the most run-heavy team in the NFL the way they were for the last couple of seasons. Maybe that stresses those guys a little bit more. Suddenly, Caleb McGarry, say, at right tackle, starts to look a little bit weaker in pass protection, but it should still be a very good offensive line. So then you've got this backfield with, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, multiple running backs that are high-quality players. The quarterback we just talked about is really good. Drake London, Kyle Pitts, those guys should be high-end receivers. And then can they get complementary play out of Darnell Mooney, Ray McLeod, who came over effectively with Zach Robinson? There are some other complementary receivers there I think that can make an impact as well. Overall, that looks like an offense that could absolutely cook. And then the question is just how good is the defense going to be? Can it help them out?
Right here on the Check the Mic channel, you'll see one of our other videos talking about, important players across the NFL. I highlighted Drake London, and I really think he's going to have a monster year. I mean, a guy that was drafted, same draft class as Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave, Jamison Williams, right near the top. He was the first guy off the board. I think his high-end ball skills, his ability to also separate, win in different ways, outstanding at the catch point. I think he has a chance to be the high-volume receiver in this offense. And just to touch on Cousins for a minute here, the NFL, when you're evaluating quarterbacks, a lot of times we think in this, do you have an elite quarterback or do you not type of terms, and clearly I don't think we're putting Kirk Cousins into that elite category. He's in that category where teams want to move on from him, right? You feel like you're maxed out at some point, but when you're a team like the Falcons that's working with the worst quarterback situation, or one of them in the NFL, they didn't have one of the top draft picks. That was the necessary move for the Falcons. So it's a big upgrade for them, and plugging Cousins into this offense. Look, I don't know that this is leading them to the NFC Championship or anything, but I think it's giving them an opportunity to win the NFC South, get into the playoffs, and see what happens. So I like the fit for Cousins here for the Falcons because of all the playmakers that they're throwing that he's throwing to. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Sam, we've got new news that may have hindered our ability to use our pre-recorded analysis on the defense. Matthew Judon is in town in Atlanta. Justin Simmons is in town in Atlanta. Look, the defense last year, I always called them feisty every single week, right? Jesse Bates was out there making game-changing plays. David Onyemata was a really good free agent signing last year. Both of those guys as free agent signings helped this Falcons defense, but even more ammunition added here during the preseason, and then Raheem Morris coming in to pull it all together.
Yeah, a couple of players coming over that had such a transformative effect that it transformed what I'm wearing and my entire studio setup here. Amazing effect that they've had on that defense. Yeah, look, we had this whole thing recorded, and we were talking about the anemic pass rush that the Atlanta Falcons have had for the last couple of years. One of the worst, if not the worst, edge rusher situations in all of football. Chicago was right there with them until they traded for Montez Sweat, and now Atlanta have made a move as well, and they bring in Matthew Judon, who at the very minimum upgrades it. I'm not sure he fixes it single-handedly, but he definitely changes the dynamic there. They at least have got now one consistent pass rusher, a guy who has had big sack seasons in the past, a guy who also, you've made this point before, has the ability to drop into coverage, to do more than simply line up and rush the passer from the edge, but can move around, can drop into coverage, can show up in these simulated pressure packages and cause problems for opposing offenses. So Judon, I don't think immediately fixes their pass rush, but definitely moves them back towards average from literally the worst situation in football in that regard.
It does, and that situation would have been Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, two guys that are probably better off as third pass rushers. At least knocks them down a peg, allows them to mix and match a little bit more, and then, as you mentioned, some flexibility with a guy like Judon who can drop into coverage. He's been a guy that drops over 100 times per season historically in the past. Ravens defense, Patriots defense. So I think it's a good fit for Raheem Morris and the Falcons. And then Justin Simmons coming in as well to pair with Jesse Bates, two ball-hawking free safety types. It's not your traditional free and strong safety. It's not your traditional box versus deep player. Both guys have similar skill sets. But I think that, again, the veteran versatility that it brings to the defense, added with Judon and that pass rush, I think those are great moves. And it helps a defensive front that the Falcons knew that they needed to address in the draft. After they went with Michael Penix Jr., they did draft defensive linemen with their next 3 picks. Now, Braylon Trice is out for the season, the 3rd rounder. That's part of the reason why they had to bring Judon in. But Rook Orororo showing some flashes during the preseason. They've got the ability to mix and match up front and maybe create some havoc.
Yeah, it was definitely an area that they knew they needed to upgrade, and that's why they spent those draft picks. Braylon Trice probably would have been a significant contributor for them, a guy that they were relying on him. Obviously, they can't do that now, so instead they pivot and they go and grab a veteran. An interesting move as well because, cost them a 3rd-round draft pick. That's pretty significant. It's also for a guy who, wants an adjusted contract. Like, part of the reason there was some issues there in New England is he wants to get paid again, or at least wants a change in his contract, but that doesn't seem like it's happening in a major way in Atlanta. They're not bringing in a guy that they're going to, re-up for a huge amount of money, at least not right now. So they are kind of playing him out really just for this year to try and upgrade that group, presumably because they think that they will be a playoff team and they are going to try and make some noise and contend. And even a 1-year rental works for them at the moment.
I want to highlight key position groups because I do believe it is on the defensive side of the ball for both of us. For me, it is still this edge rush group, even adding Matthew Judon. Again, we're looking at Raheem Morris coming over from the Rams, and they didn't really have a great edge rush situation over the last couple of years. It was Aaron Donald who created all of the havoc. Now, the Falcons have Grady Jarrett. Their version of Aaron Donald, of course, we would never compare Grady Jarrett to Aaron Donald. He is not at that level, but he's your interior disruptor. David Onyemata can do some of that as well. But, Raheem's edge rushers would, drop into coverage, rush the passer. They haven't really been the guy that's relied upon. So I think that kind of fits, but they needed a little bit more juice off the edge there. That's where I think adding Judon is going to help. It'll upgrade it a little bit. They still might not be even in the middle of the pack as pure edge rush group goes in the NFL, but it gives them a little bit more flexibility to pair with those interior disruptors of Grady Jarrett and David Onyemata, Zach Harrison as well, a guy that can move around. So look, that's a big group for me. It takes a little bit of pressure off the back end if they can get more pressure with their front 4.
Yeah, I mean, even with Judon coming over, I still think that that's an area of weakness for them and maybe a key area for the entire team, for the defense. The single biggest area of concern for me, or a key area, would be that number 2 cornerback position, though. A.J. Terrell, I think, is a really good player. His life will be made easier by the fact that Judon is now there, bringing some kind of source of pressure from the edge along with those guys in the middle. But that second spot, that number 2 guy, and even the number 3 guy potentially, outside of A.J. Terrell, their cornerback positions are not amazing on paper. A guy like Mike Hughes is potentially a starter as the number 2 guy. Now, that's helped by upgrading up front with Judon. It's helped by potentially upgrading behind them as well with safety. But still, that's an area that could absolutely be exposed by high-level starting NFL wide receivers.
All right, let's flip it forward to this entire season here. A best and worst case scenario for the Falcons. What does your best case scenario here look like?
I still think that the best case scenario has a ceiling to it. I think that they're a playoff team. Their best case probably involves not just making the postseason, but maybe winning a game or 2 there, upsetting a team. I just don't see that they can really get through to, a Super Bowl or even maybe a championship game. I feel like their ceiling is probably at that level and no further.
I think the best case, forget about where they end up on their way to the Super Bowl, right? I mean, I'm with you. If they made it to the final 8, much like the Bucs did last year, I think that would be a pretty successful season, winning a playoff game, getting into the divisional round. But I think the best case involves a lot of excitement, man. You got Kirk in there. You got Zach Robinson calling plays. You have all those playmakers, all those first-round picks from the last few years at all the skill positions, and you get to see all those guys play to their potential, the potential of Bijan and Pitts and London. So I think we've got a lot of excitement and big years on the offensive side of the ball for the Falcons if everything goes right. What about worst case scenario, though? What if things don't go so well?
Yeah, I mean, the worst case probably involves some kind of Kirk Cousins not being the same, coming off that Achilles injury at 35 years old, not having solved the quarterback position definitively with what they've done this offseason, the Kirk Cousins addition of free agency, Michael Penix Jr. at the top of the draft. If somehow that doesn't result in unequivocal, correct answer quarterback, that I think is the worst case, which ends up with them not being any better than a year ago, with them still not being a playoff team, with them still being trapped in this kind of purgatory world of not really having line of sight of the next quarterback and not having the quarterback. I think that would be a true worst case scenario for the Falcons, that with all this upgrading, they still didn't really move forward.
Yeah, and that's what, look, Cousins is a very good quarterback, but at the end of the day, every team he's been with, he's made them better, but they've hit a ceiling, right? Which is what you've highlighted. I would also throw in on the defensive side of the ball those two key position groups that you and I mentioned. If cornerback 2 or the pass rush generally, if that's not up to par with playoff caliber teams, could be rough on that side of the ball for the Falcons.